When an avoidant betrays someone who truly loved them, the story they tell themselves is usually very simple. They convince themselves that emotional distance is strength. They believe that the ability to detach quickly, to shut down feelings, to walk away without looking back, proves that they are in control. In their mind, not needing anyone becomes a kind of power. And in the short term, it can feel exactly like that. Because when you shut down emotionally, you don't feel the immediate consequences of your actions. You don't feel the weight of the loss. You don't sit with the grief. You move forward quickly. You distract yourself. You tell yourself that life is easier this way. But what many avoidants don't realize is that the same mechanism they use to protect themselves from pain also blocks their ability to experience deep connection. Emotional numbness doesn't have an on and off switch. It's not something you can activate only when it's convenient. When you train yourself to suppress vulnerability, you also suppress intimacy, warmth, and genuine closeness. At first, this doesn't look like a problem. In fact, it can feel like freedom. They move through relationships lightly. Nothing feels too heavy. Nothing feels too serious. If something becomes uncomfortable, they simply withdraw. If someone asks for emotional depth, they step back. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Life starts to feel flat. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just quietly empty. Conversations become repetitive. Connections feel surface level. Moments that should feel meaningful don't quite reach the emotional depth they once could. And slowly, a realization begins to form, often without them fully understanding why. Because when someone who truly cared about them was in their life, there was emotional richness. There was someone willing to see them deeply, to understand their fears, to stay through discomfort. That kind of connection creates emotional depth that can't be replicated through casual interaction or constant distraction. And once that person is gone, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant may not immediately admit this to themselves. Pride and defense mechanisms are powerful forces, but internally, there's a quiet awareness that something is missing. Not just the person they betrayed, but the experience of being truly known by someone. What once felt like control begins to reveal itself as limitation. They realize that the walls they built to keep others out have also trapped them inside. Every relationship now stops at the same invisible boundary. Every connection reaches a point where vulnerability is required. And that is exactly where they retreat. This is where karma begins to operate, not as punishment, but as consequence. Because the emotional numbness they relied on to escape responsibility slowly turns into isolation. Not the dramatic loneliness people imagine, but the deeper kind. The kind where you are surrounded by people and still feel unseen. The kind where conversations happen, laughter happens, life continues, but something essential is missing. And eventually, many avoidants face a moment of clarity. They recognize that their greatest defense mechanism also became their greatest barrier. The strategy that protected them from heartbreak also prevented them from experiencing the depth of love that makes life meaningful. And when that realization arrives, it carries a quiet but powerful truth. The walls we build to protect ourselves from pain can eventually become the very prisons that keep us from love. After the emotional shutdown begins to reveal its hidden cost, another realization slowly starts to surface. Many avoidants convince themselves that what they truly need is freedom. Not freedom in the healthy sense, the freedom to grow or explore life, but freedom from emotional responsibility, freedom from expectations, freedom from vulnerability. When they betray someone who loved them deeply, this belief becomes their justification. In their mind, the relationship felt restrictive. Maybe it required emotional honesty they weren't ready to give. Maybe it demanded consistency, accountability, or deeper intimacy than they felt comfortable with. So they tell themselves a story. Life will be easier once they're no longer tied down. And in the beginning, it often feels exactly that way. There's a rush that comes with walking away from commitment. Suddenly, there are no difficult conversations waiting for you, no emotional expectations, no one asking you to open up or explain what you're feeling. The world feels wide again. Possibilities seem endless. New people, new attention, new experiences. It creates the illusion that you've reclaimed something valuable, but illusions have a short lifespan. Because freedom without emotional depth eventually reveals itself as something else entirely. It becomes emptiness disguised as independence. At first, the avoidant may surround themselves with distractions. Social circles expand. Dating becomes casual and easy. Conversations stay light, playful, entertaining. On the surface, everything seems exciting. But beneath that excitement, something important is missing. Depth. Real connection requires time, vulnerability, and emotional investment. And when someone has trained themselves to avoid those things, their relationships rarely move beyond the surface. People come and go, interactions feel pleasant but temporary. The spark that initially feels thrilling fades quickly because nothing deeper is being built underneath it. Over time, patterns start repeating. New connections begin with enthusiasm, but they don't last. Conversations remain interesting but never meaningful. Moments that should create emotional closeness never quite reach that level. And eventually, a subtle question begins to form in the avoidance mind. Why does everything feel so temporary? This is where karma quietly begins its work, because the freedom they chased was never the same as fulfillment. The excitement they felt at first was simply novelty, and novelty always fades. What replaces it is the reality of their emotional habits, and that's when the comparison begins. Not always consciously, but inevitably. They start remembering the person they betrayed, the one who offered patience, loyalty, and emotional presence. The one who was willing to stay even when things were difficult. The one who saw past their defenses and tried to build something real. That kind of connection is rare. And once it's gone, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the casual conversations feel thinner. The temporary attention feels less meaningful. The independence they once celebrated starts to feel strangely hollow, because what they gave up was not just a relationship. It was the possibility of emotional depth. And here's the deeper psychological truth. Humans are not wired for endless detachment. We are wired for connection, for belonging, for being understood by someone who sees us completely. You can delay that need. You can suppress it. You can distract yourself from it for years. But eventually, the absence of real connection becomes undeniable. That is when the avoidant begins to realize something profound. The freedom they believed would make them happy was never true freedom. It was simply distance from responsibility, from vulnerability, and from the very experiences that create meaning in life. And when that realization arrives, it carries a quiet but powerful lesson. Freedom without connection doesn't create happiness, it creates emptiness. Once the excitement of freedom fades and the emotional emptiness begins to surface, something else quietly starts happening in the mind of the avoidant. It's subtle at first, almost unconscious, but it becomes one of the most powerful psychological forces they experience after losing someone who truly cared about them. They start comparing, not intentionally, not because they want to relive the past. In fact, most avoidants try very hard not to think about the person they betrayed. Avoidance, by definition, is a strategy of emotional escape. They move forward quickly, they meet new people, they keep life moving so they don't have to sit with uncomfortable memories, but the mind doesn't work that way. When someone has experienced a relationship where they were deeply supported, understood, and emotionally accepted, that experience leaves a psychological imprint. It becomes a reference point, and every relationship that follows is, in some way, measured against that reference. So the avoidant meets someone new. At first, things feel exciting. There's curiosity, attraction, novelty. The conversation flows, the attention feels good, and the newness of it all creates a temporary emotional high. But then slowly, comparisons begin to creep in. Maybe the new person isn't as patient. Maybe they don't listen the same way. Maybe they don't understand the avoidance emotional patterns as deeply as the previous partner did. Maybe when conflict arises, this new person simply walks away instead of trying to understand. And suddenly the avoidant experiences something they didn't expect: contrast. Because the partner they betrayed may have given them something rare: emotional tolerance, the ability to stay calm during distance, to offer understanding when the avoidant pulled away, to continue investing even when things were uncertain. That kind of emotional maturity is not easy to find. So the avoidant begins noticing small differences, not dramatic ones at first, just subtle realizations, conversations that feel less meaningful, reactions that feel less supportive, moments where they expect the same patience they once received, but it's no longer there. And here's the psychological irony. While they were in the relationship, they may have taken those qualities for granted. When someone is consistently supportive, consistently understanding, consistently patient, it can start to feel ordinary. The avoidant becomes so accustomed to that stability that they stop recognizing its value. But once it's gone, the absence becomes extremely visible. Now, every interaction highlights what used to exist. Every new relationship exposes the difference between surface-level connection and genuine emotional investment. And the mind begins replaying memories. Moments where the previous partner showed loyalty, times when they stayed during difficult conversations, instances where they tried to build emotional closeness rather than run from it. The avoidant may resist these thoughts at first. They may tell themselves that the past is the past, that moving on is the healthiest option. And in many ways, that's true. But psychologically, comparison doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. Instead, it grows stronger with each repeated experience. Each time a new relationship fails to reach the same emotional depth, the realization becomes clearer. What they once had was not easily replaceable. And this is one of the quietest but most powerful forms of karma. Not dramatic revenge, not sudden suffering, but the slow recognition that the person they walked away from offered something profoundly valuable. Because genuine connection is rare. Real emotional understanding is rare. And someone who is willing to invest deeply in a relationship despite challenges, that is even rarer. When the avoidant finally understands this, it often arrives with a difficult truth. By the time you realize the value of what you lost, the opportunity to rebuild it may already be gone. And that realization carries a powerful lesson for anyone listening today. The people who love us deeply are often the ones we understand the least, until they're no longer there. As time goes on, another pattern begins to reveal itself, one that is far more difficult for the avoidant to escape. Because leaving a relationship doesn't mean leaving your emotional patterns behind. The relationship ends. The person disappears from your daily life, but the psychology that shaped your behavior stays exactly where it was. This is one of the most important truths about human behavior. Wherever you go, you take your patterns with you. So the avoidant enters a new relationship. At first, everything feels different. New personality, new energy, new conversations. It creates the sense that this time things will be easier. This time things will work better, but patterns are patient. At the beginning, avoidants often show the best version of themselves. They're attentive, engaging, even emotionally present. Because early relationships don't require deep vulnerability yet. The stakes are low, the emotional risk is minimal. But eventually, every real relationship reaches a turning point. A moment where emotional intimacy begins to deepen, expectations grow. Conversations become more honest. The other person starts asking for consistency, clarity, emotional openness, and that's when the familiar discomfort begins to rise. The avoidant may not even consciously understand what they're feeling. It's not always obvious fear. Sometimes it appears as irritation. Sometimes it feels like boredom. Sometimes it creates a vague sense that something is off with the relationship. But beneath the surface, the same internal alarm system is activating. Closeness begins to feel overwhelming. Emotional dependency feels threatening. The idea of being fully seen by another person starts to create anxiety. So the avoidant does what they've always done. They pull back. Communication becomes less frequent. Emotional conversations are avoided. Small conflicts suddenly feel exhausting. The avoidant begins creating distance, often without fully realizing why. And eventually the relationship starts to weaken. Maybe the other person becomes frustrated with the emotional distance. Maybe misunderstandings grow because honest communication never fully happens. Or maybe the relationship simply fades away as the avoidant slowly withdraws. Then the relationship ends. And for a moment, the avoidant may believe the same story again. That the relationship just wasn't the right fit. That the other person expected too much. That things simply didn't work out. But when this cycle repeats several times, something harder to ignore begins to emerge. The pattern. Different people, different personalities, different circumstances. Yet the ending always feels strangely familiar. Closeness appears, then distance follows. Emotional investment grows, then withdrawal happens. Relationships begin with promise, but collapse once deeper intimacy is required. And eventually the avoidant faces a realization that is both uncomfortable and transformative. The common factor in every failed relationship isn't the other person, it's them. This is one of the most profound moments of psychological awareness a person can experience, because it forces a shift from external blame to internal reflection. The avoidant can no longer explain every relationship failure as bad luck or incompatibility. They begin to see that the same protective behaviors that once helped them survive emotionally are now sabotaging their ability to sustain love. The distancing, the emotional shutdown, the instinct to retreat when vulnerability appears. All of it forms a pattern that quietly dismantles connection before it has the chance to grow. And this is where karma becomes deeply educational rather than purely painful, because the pattern keeps repeating until the lesson is finally understood. You cannot build lasting connection while running from emotional intimacy. Sooner or later, every avoidant reaches a crossroads. Continue repeating the cycle, or confront the internal fears that created it. And that moment reveals one of life's most powerful truths. Until we face the patterns within ourselves, we will keep recreating the same endings with different people. At some point in this process, another moment often appears, one that many avoidants never expected to face. Because when they walked away or when they betrayed someone who truly cared about them, there was usually an unspoken assumption in their mind, an assumption that the other person would remain emotionally stuck. They imagine that the person they left behind will stay hurt for a long time, that they'll remain attached, waiting, hoping, or struggling to move on. In a strange way, that belief protects the avoidant's ego. It allows them to feel that even if they walked away, they still hold emotional power in the situation. But life rarely follows the story we create in our heads. Because while the avoidant is busy distracting themselves, chasing freedom, or repeating familiar patterns, the person they betrayed often begins a very different journey. At first, there may be pain, confusion, a period of deep emotional processing. After all, betrayal forces people to confront powerful feelings, loss, rejection, disappointment. But for many people, that pain becomes a turning point rather than a permanent state. They begin to reflect. They start rebuilding their sense of self. They focus on healing the parts of themselves that tolerated emotional inconsistency or accepted less than they deserved. Slowly, something powerful begins to happen. They grow. Confidence returns. Emotional clarity strengthens. They become more selective about who they allow into their life. And most importantly, they begin creating a life that is not defined by the person who left them. This transformation doesn't always happen quickly, but when it does, it is unmistakable. The person who once invested all their emotional energy into the relationship now invests that energy into themselves. Their world expands. Their self-respect deepens. They become emotionally stronger than they were before. And eventually, the avoidant sees it. Maybe it happens through social media, maybe through mutual friends, maybe through a chance encounter. However it happens, the avoidant suddenly notices something they didn't anticipate. You're doing well without them. You're not chasing them. You're not waiting for them. You're not emotionally stuck in the place where they left you. Instead, you're moving forward with confidence, stability, and a sense of self-worth that no longer depends on their validation. And this moment can be deeply unsettling for the avoidant, because it challenges the silent narrative they carried with them. The idea that they were the center of your emotional world. The belief that your happiness would somehow remain connected to their presence. Instead, they are confronted with a different reality. You adapted, you healed, you grew stronger, and suddenly the power dynamic they once assumed existed begins to reverse. The person they believed would always care deeply about them has developed boundaries, independence, and emotional resilience. This realization can create a powerful wave of regret. Not necessarily because they suddenly want to rebuild the relationship, but because they begin to see the value of what they lost. They recognize that the person they once took for granted is no longer standing in the same emotional place. You evolved, and that evolution highlights something important. Growth doesn't just heal wounds, it changes how others see you. When someone witnesses the strength you developed after they hurt you, it forces them to confront the consequences of their own choices. This is one of karma's most profound forms. Not revenge, but transformation. Your progress becomes a mirror reflecting what they walked away from. And in that moment, the avoidant often understands something they didn't realize before. The person they left behind didn't fall apart, they rose. And sometimes the greatest regret in life is realizing too late that the person you underestimated became stronger without you. And eventually, the final realization arrives in a way that is both quiet and deeply symbolic. Because one of the most common ways avoidants end relationships is through distance. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's sudden, but the pattern is familiar. Communication becomes colder, responses become shorter, and emotional presence slowly disappears. Instead of confronting the truth directly, they retreat. Conversations that once felt natural become uncomfortable. Honest discussions about feelings are avoided, and eventually, silence takes the place of clarity. For the person on the receiving end, this silence can be incredibly painful. It leaves questions unanswered. It creates confusion. It forces someone to process loss without closure. In many cases, the avoidant believes this distance is the easiest way to move forward. If they don't engage emotionally, if they simply disappear into their own world, the situation feels less complicated. But silence has a way of circling back, because communication patterns tend to repeat themselves. The emotional habits we practice eventually shape the experiences we receive from others. When someone consistently avoids vulnerability, avoids difficult conversations, and avoids emotional accountability, they unintentionally train themselves to live in a world where connection is fragile. At first, they may not notice it. Life continues. New relationships appear. New conversations begin. But something begins to feel different over time. Messages that once came quickly now take longer. Plans fall through more often. People who once seemed interested suddenly become distant. The avoidant might initially dismiss these moments as coincidence. Maybe people are just busy. Maybe the connection simply faded. But as the pattern repeats itself, a deeper awareness begins to emerge. The same silence they once created now begins to surround them. They send a message and receive no response. They reach out to reconnect with someone who seemed interested, but the enthusiasm is gone. Conversations fade without explanation. Opportunities for deeper connection quietly disappear. And in these moments, they experience something familiar, uncertainty. They begin to feel the same confusion they once caused someone else, the same unanswered questions, the same sense of distance that leaves a person wondering what changed. This is where the psychological mirror appears, because karma often works through experience. It allows people to feel, from the other side, the emotional impact of patterns they once created. The avoidant who relied on silence to escape emotional responsibility now finds themselves facing the emotional consequences of silence itself, not as punishment, but as reflection. They begin to understand that communication isn't just about exchanging words. It's about emotional presence. It's about showing up when things become uncomfortable instead of retreating into distance. When someone repeatedly avoids that responsibility, relationships begin to lose their foundation. People sense the emotional absence. Trust becomes difficult to build, and eventually others begin protecting themselves by pulling back first. This is when the avoidant starts realizing something important. Connection requires courage. It requires the willingness to stay present when conversations become difficult. It requires honesty when emotions feel complicated. Without that courage, relationships slowly dissolve into the same silence they once used to escape. And when they finally recognize this pattern, the lesson becomes clear. The distance they once created didn't just protect them from vulnerability, it slowly disconnected them from the very relationships they hoped to keep. Because in the end, silence is never neutral. It always leaves an echo. And the most powerful truth to remember is this: the emotional energy we give to others has a way of returning to us, sometimes in ways we never expected. As we step back and look at everything we've discussed, a deeper picture begins to emerge. Karma, in this context, is not some dramatic force of revenge. It's not about watching someone suffer or hoping life punishes them for what they did. Real karma is far more subtle and far more powerful. It is the natural unfolding of consequences. When someone betrays a loyal partner and chooses emotional avoidance instead of growth, they carry those same patterns into every part of their life. The numbness that once protected them slowly becomes isolation. The freedom they chased reveals its hidden emptiness. Every new relationship begins to highlight what they lost. Their own patterns quietly sabotage connection again and again. And eventually, they witness the person they once underestimated rising, healing, and building a life that no longer revolves around them. And then comes the final mirror. The silence they once used to escape emotional responsibility begins to surround them. And in those moments, something important becomes clear. Not always immediately, but eventually. The avoidant begins to understand that the real loss was never just the relationship. The real loss was the opportunity to experience deep, honest connection with someone who was willing to stand beside them through growth. Because genuine love is not something that appears endlessly in life. It is rare. It requires vulnerability, patience, and emotional courage. And when someone walks away from it without understanding its value, the lesson doesn't disappear. It simply waits until they are ready to see it. But here's the most important part of this entire conversation. Your story was never meant to end with their betrayal. The real purpose of pain is transformation. When you heal, when you grow, when you learn to value yourself more deeply than before, you step into a completely different level of emotional strength. You stop chasing validation from people who are afraid of intimacy. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who cannot recognize it. Instead, you become the kind of person who understands their own value. And when that shift happens, something powerful changes. You stop focusing on whether karma will reach the person who hurt you because you realize something far more important. Your greatest victory is not their regret. It's your evolution. The moment you reclaim your confidence, your peace, and your emotional independence, you step out of the past and into a future that is no longer limited by someone else's fears. And that leads us to the final truth I want to leave you with today. The greatest form of karma isn't watching someone realize what they lost. The greatest karma is becoming someone who no longer needs them to realize it.